many thanks to Vesa for the very generous presentation, introduction, and to you for this invitation. I come back to this institute after 10 years. The first time I came was exactly 10 years ago for a conference organized by the Finnish Marx Society. And in the past years I've been working very often with Finnish colleagues, in particular with Vesa, but not only with him. And we did many publications together in different locations, since I was in Naples and then when I moved to Canada. So once again, I'm very glad to come back here and to do, I'm looking forward to do more projects together with the Institute and with the Finnish Marx Society. So my presentation today is based on late Marx and in particular on his remarks about Russia. But you allow me to spend the first part of my presentation, the first 15–20% of my presentation, speaking a little bit about Marx. Because I wanted to collocate a little bit research on Marx today internationally. When I started to work on Marx, when I started my PhD in 2002 in Italy, I, as many students do, I became fascinated by the extraordinary particularity of Marx's writings. And I've been thinking, I've been working on many years on the fact that Marx published a number of writings that was relatively small compared to the project that he started and that he wanted to carry on during his life. This is particularly true for the late Marx, but I'll talk about this later. So, like every student who is always a little bit in love with the subject of his research, I thought that this was a characteristic that was peculiar only to Marx, or in particular to Marx. Later I learned that it was not the case, because as you know very well, and Vesa is a master in the history of philosophy, there are many other giants of the philosophical thought or political theory, sociology, whatever you want, that left many manuscripts, many projects uncompleted. And they were lucky or less lucky to have good editors, sometimes members of the family, sometimes pupils, students, etc., who published this manuscript. Marx was very lucky, I would say, because despite all the problems that there were for the second and third volume of Capital, published by Engels in 1885 and 1894, Engels was a very competent person, despite the fact that Marx wrote on Capital alone and without Engels. And many times in his life he said, there is nobody who can publish this manuscript except myself. He said the same also to Engels. This is also true for many socialists. No, I made the example of Hegel, Nietzsche for the classics. You know, I'm talking about incompleteness. But if you think, for example, to the work of another master, Saint-Simon, for example, Claude-Henri de Saint-Simon, well, you know that the Saint-Simonian published, and in a very controverted way, his writings. So if we look at Marx's publication, we see that many of the works that we consider completed works, and actually some of them are considered also as canonic text or textbooks for the Marxist-Leninist school of thought, they were actually not published by Marx, and sometimes not conceived at all for the publication by Marx. So this is the first point that I want to make, because I will come back later on this, since I'm focusing part of my reflection on this kind of unfinished, uncompleted Marx. If you look at the early writings and the needs of the young Marx, you know, a subject that has taken very much of the research on Marx. I'm thinking about the German ideology, 1845-46, the economical manuscript written, philosophical economical manuscript written in Paris in 1844. Those works did not exist, and they were built later, more or less 100 years after they were written, because they were used according to political condition and situation. For example, the Parisian notebooks were very relevant in the existentialist post-World War II France, while the German ideology was, again, the textbook that Soviet Union needed to fight idealism and to build the historical materialism conception, a word that Marx never used. So, Marx published with Engels The Holy Family in 1845. Marx published Poverty of Philosophy in 1847, two texts that nobody read despite the fact that were published by Marx. Then the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Then many people ignore, but Marx was a journalist for many years of his life. He needed money to survive. You all know that he had very serious difficulties to survive. And he collaborated in these journalist experiences. He collaborated for the New York Tribune, the New York Daily Tribune, between the beginning of the 50s and 1862, 51, 62. This was the main newspaper in the United States of America. Later, Marx published a book in 1859, which was called The Critique of Political Economy, which was very, very unsuccessful because the only person who reviewed it was Friedrich Engels. And in 1860, he wrote another thick volume called Herr Vogt, Mr. Vogt, which was a sort of response to the accusation that he received from this former member of the 1848 parliament in Frankfurt. And then, obviously, the publication of Capital. I would say that until this period, the publication of Capital, and most importantly, the fact that Marx became, in 1864, the main organizer of the International Working Men Association, in particular after 1871 and the Paris Commune, and the addresses that Marx wrote on the Paris Commune, the so-called civil war in France, this is the period when Marx texts started to circulate. Today we have many new materials, and the new scholarship of Marx is based not only on the fact that it is no longer connected to the state in Soviet Union and the policies made by Russian governments until 1991, but the new scholarship of Marx is based also on these many new volumes published from 1998, more than 20, in the new critical edition called the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe. What is interesting of this publication and why Marx will be an object of scholarship for many, many years, I believe. First of all, these early writings are republished in a new, different way. The most important example is the German ideology. A new edition just came out that shows that these chapters, the chapter on Feuerbach, the chapter on Stirner, etc., they were built by the editors. We have also many interesting things about the notebooks that Marx wrote in the early 50s, the so-called London notebooks, and there are many interesting things there. We have the publication recently completed of all the preparatory manuscript of Capital, starting from the Grundrisse in 1857 and ending in late 1881, so 14 years after Marx completed and tried to rewrite and correct even volume 1 of Capital published in 1867. And then there are all these rich manuscripts of the late Marx, notebooks of research. Before I go there, I wanted to say that beside the new materials, there are also many scholars who are revisiting Marx and are opening new, interesting, and critical, many times, very useful, therefore, points of view of Marx, book scholarship of Marx. Think, for example, the publication on Marx and ecology, which represents today a very important topic in Marxian scholarship that has been ignored for many decades. So I believe that in this revival, in this renaissance for studies of Marx, the late Marx is going to be one of the most interesting Marx that will be rediscovered or reread critically, to say that it was good, to highlight the many mistakes that he did. But I believe that the late Marx is particularly important. It's important because he looked at many non-European societies. So if you read the late Marx, you understand that it is not true at all, the idea that Marx is merely focused with the conflict between capital and wage labor and merely in Europe, because Marx is starting to study many new disciplines. The most important is anthropology. There are the ethnological notebooks. Again, there is a new edition coming out very soon for Yale University Press at the end of this year. And also because Marx was particularly interested in communal ownership of property. So Marx is studying capitalism and what might happen after capitalism, never in an utopian way, also using other disciplines. The most important example, I will refer to this later, is the American anthropologist Morgan, who wrote the influential book Ancient Society, that Marx read almost immediately. So this is the introduction that I wanted to do. And in this introduction, I will focus on Russia and on the late Marx. I will try not to be too boring, but I've been also asked to read some quotation, and I take this meeting also as a seminar, and I'm looking forward for your criticism, question, and discussion. So Marx always considered Russia early in his life as a sort of most representative part in the political arena in which he was fighting. He was an actor, starting from 1848, the most important counter-revolutionary, regressive, conservative subject. So Marx wrote many times in the New York Tribune, Marx wrote many times in another book he published called The Secret Diplomatic History of the 18th Century, a book, again, that has been forgotten and that was not even published in the Soviet Union because Marx criticized the role that Russia had acquiring, the Eastern European countries. So there were very dangerous similitudes with the role that the Soviet Union started to have, starting from 1956 in Hungary. In these writings, Marx is saying that Russia is social backwardness, Russia is slow economic development, that Russia is a despotic political regime, and that Russia played always a very conservative role in international policy. Marx had many times this fixation that people in England government, they were related to Russia, and sometimes there was corruption, etc. So if you read, for example, the 1882 preface to the second edition of, to the Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto, Marx wrote, during 48 and 49, not only European princes, but also European bourgeoisie was very safe against the growing workers' movement, thanks to Russia, thanks to the role that Russia always played. Well, Marx started to change this perception of Russia for many things. First of all, for many reasons. First of all, because Marx was a very careful, rigorous, and analytical scholar. With the many mistakes that he might have done, he cannot be, in my opinion, associated to the dogmatic economicistic Marxism that was so influential and hegemonic in the 20th century. So if Marx wanted to open his mouth or write a word about Russia, he had to start Russian. He had to study Russian. And this is what he did. In the middle of the writing of Capital, he suspended everything, and from the beginning of the 70s, he started to study Russia, and he started to read many statistics on Russian societies, many new books about the situation of post-1869 Russia, and he also started to correspond with many Russian scholars. If you read some letters, or there are some conversation, people who said what happened between Marx and Engels, their contemporaries, many people say how much Engels hated Marx's passion for Russia, because Engels was absolutely concerned that Marx could finish as much as possible Capital, and he could not believe that any time that he entered in Marx's house, after he moved in London at the beginning of the 70s, instead of finding on these tables the manuscript of Capital, he found again those Russian statistics, and Marx was only talking about Russian. But Marx was talking about many other things, but this is a serious concern and preoccupation, and this is also to show you what kind of scholar Marx was. There is also another reason. The reason is also the disappointment for the British working class. Marx is a militant who has done a very important political experience between 1864 and 1872. And in this experience, he saw how much trade union reformism in Britain was strong, and he also saw later, you know the famous expression, the aristocracy of the working class, how much sometimes, not the French revolutionaries, workers, but how much sometimes the European working class was using also colonialism and other things in order to enjoy the better condition that they achieved, but in a reformist way, without struggling for the collapse of the system, without fighting against for the end of the capitalist mode of production. So Marx is saying, perhaps if we look and make a comparison between Britain and Russia, perhaps there might be cases, there might be chances that the revolution is happening more in Russia than in Britain, earlier in Russia than Britain. This point is very key, and I will go back to this point later. I also have no time, and I will be very superficial, and I will be criticized for this, but then I have 1 more hour to respond to your comments and questions. Because obviously Marx developed many other ideas about other society. Takes, for example, Ireland and Britain, or takes, for example, what happened in Paris in 1871. So he had already learned many other times that there could be other factors, political factors that introduce, that intervene in the revolution. So it's not a dogmatic, exclusively focused on economic development conception. In 1881, while Marx is reading this very fascinating book of the anthropologist Morgan, Ancient Society, and while he's reading about these old forms of communal ownership, Marx goes outside for a walk at Hampstead Heath, and when he comes back, I'm making a little bit Italian dramatic, but when he comes back, he opens the post and he found a letter. And this letter was written by a young Russian revolutionary. Her name was Vera Zasulich. And she was a member of a populist group. And in this letter, she asked Marx what, for her and her comrades, was a question of life and death. So he's asking Marx, who at the time was already known in Russia, because Capital was translated in French and then in Russian, and sold also very well. He asked Marx whether he could help them to understand what was going to happen with these particular things that exist in Russia, the Obshchina, the rural commune. The question was very simple, but was very dramatic. Zasulich asked in the name of a group, on behalf of a group, whether the Obshchina could turn into a socialist form of ownership and production, skipping the capitalist phase, or whether they should just wait that the bourgeoisie took the power in Russia, and that, she said, who knows how many centuries capitalism is going to become the dominant mode of production, and then we can go in front of the factories and give flyers to the working class. So Marx was asked to answer to this question, and this question arrived exactly when Marx was studying the old communal forms of ownership. And Marx was already developing some ideas that I will not be able to present today. So there is another thing that Vera Zasulich wrote to Marx, and she said that many Marxists were saying that the Obshchina cannot become a communist and socialist form of production, but it has to go through capitalism. And these Marxists, they said Marx said so. So Marx felt also this responsibility, even though he said many times that he had no contact with these followers, and actually he was in contact with many populist leaders who, as you all know here, since you are all scholars of Russia, were actually fighting for the first option, that the Obshchina could become a socialist form of production, and could skip, and that Russia could skip capitalism. So before I enter into a brief analysis, because time is running, of what Marx wrote to Russian scholars, I wanted to say very briefly, also because this is the topic of a talk that I'm having in a few weeks at the University of Tampere, what Marx said about capitalism, and in particular about capitalism as a prerequisite of socialist mode of production, for those of you who are not experts of Marx. I'm sure that you have heard that Marx wrote with Engels in the Communist Manifesto that capitalism was exploiting new geographical discoveries, and there was also the birth of the world market. The bourgeoisie had given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. And they are growing the modern working class, the proletarians, so the subject for the revolution. In 1853, I'm just quoting some published articles or books written by Marx. In 1853, Marx said the same. When he was, as a journalist, observing India, perhaps in a naive conception of colonialism that he will change, improve much more later in his life, he said, as it is very well known, that the British colonialism were playing a double role. Colonialists were playing a double role in India. And one of this role was positive because they were bringing capitalism, and thanks to this there would have been development later in a revolutionary form. Perhaps most importantly is capital. Marx in Capital Volume 1 wrote that there were 6 very important things, achievements, that capitalist mode of production made in light of the birth of the communist society. The cooperative labor process, the scientific technological contribution to production, the appropriation of the forces of nature by production, creation of machinery that workers can only operate in common, the economization of all means of production, and the tendencies to create the world market. These are very important elements for Marx. And in all his writings, you will see that Marx is evaluating in a very positive way this characteristic of the capitalist mode of production in order to having a working class that is fighting for socialism. And he's looking in a very skeptical way to this experiments of idea of a socialism that is not focused on the development of human beings, of human emancipation. Marx is also talking about gender role in capital in the addresses of the First International, and he is also criticizing, for example, the religion or other things that exist in not only in Indian villages, but also in Europe during feudalism. Unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about this. So I want to make clear that this Marx is obviously very well aware of the negative elements of capitalism and the destruction, exploitation, and poverties that produce, but is looking at capitalism in this dialectical way and also as a possibility for having some conditions in order to not automatically move into socialism, as many Marxists believed and said after Marx, but in order to have a working class that with class consciousness is fighting for a socialist mode of production. And in this point, it's always very important to stress the individual emancipation, the freedom and liberty of the individuals. If you read the Grundrisse, you will see how many times Marx is worried and concentrated about this issue, and it is very dramatic that the left, progressive forces, or Marxist interpretation too often, too many times, left the word freedom, liberty, individual liberties and freedoms in the hands of conservatives, schools of thought, or political parties. So to go back to Russia and to start my run toward the end of the presentation, I still have the third final part. I wanted to say that before 1881, before that letter that Marx received from Vera Zasulich, he also wrote in 1877, he also read in 1877 a review, a long article published in a journal, the English translation of the journal is Patriotic Notes, and it's a review of Capital, and it was written by a very important person. His name is Mikhailovsky. He was a populist leader, and he was much closer, Marx was much closer to him than he could imagine. He was in favor of thesis 1, in favor of the fact that Russia can skip capitalism and could move in a more emancipatory mode of production without passing through the dramatic conditions of capital. But he wrote that Marx had a different opinion. And the idea here is that many people believe that Marx thought that it was a fatality. It was something that capitalism should happen also in Russia. So this article that Marx read, written by Mikhailovsky, and the letter of Vera Zasulich, from two different points of view, one more focused on theory, the second one much more political, related to the life of activists and members of the movements for the emancipation, are asking to Marx similar questions, or they are a sign of a sort of misconception of ideas that Marx could have had at the time. It's very curious that Marx did not answer, did not respond to this review of Mikhailovsky, but he prepared a draft that was never sent, and that Marx wrote a very long letter to Zasulich. He wrote 3 long drafts, and he worked only for 3 weeks. I'm talking about a very old Marx. He's 63 years old, he's dying in 1883, and he had a very complicated life. So he devoted a lot of time to this, but also the letter of Zasulich. As I will tell you in the end, this long draft were not sent, they were not published. He just wrote a very short letter, as I will tell you, which, by the way, was not even published by Zasulich and her group. So in this letter, Marx is always quoting a very important passage for Capital that I'm going to read for you. But not from Capital, the German edition of 1867, but from the French edition that Marx published between 72 and 75, because he was not only working on the second and third volume, but hoping that he could finish the second volume of Capital, but he was also trying to improve the first volume. And there are some changes that he made in the French edition, and more changes he wanted to do if we had the strength, if there would have been another German edition. So Marx is saying in the so-called primitive accumulation section that he had sought to describe how the solution of the economic structure of feudal society set free the elements of the economic structure of capitalist society in Western Europe. So Marx is writing here, and later he will repeat this, that he thought that what he wrote was an analysis of the old continent and not an analysis that could be used in every part of the world and in every moment of history. Marx wrote, again in the French edition of Capital, that the expropriation of agricultural producer was important, but adding that only in England had this been accomplished in a radical manner, and that all the other countries of Western Europe were not, for this reason, following the same course. They did not follow the same course. So the response of Marx to these ideas that became much more influential later among Marxists, and ideas that were very different from what Marx taught, is that he did not want to write a sketch of the genesis of capitalism in the world, or in a historical philosophical theory of the general course fatally imposed to every country, to every part of the world. This is very much related to Vera Zasulich and is much related to our discussion on Russia, because when Vera Zasulich asked Marx those dramatic questions, it's about life or death, Marx is once again using the same passage. Marx wanted to make sure that their readers and the activist members of the parties that were existing at the time only in few countries of Europe, but they knew that he believed that the Obshchina was considered by Marx as a possible germ for the birth of a socialist society. So in parts of these letters, of these drafts, these three different drafts, the first in particular is very long, Marx said that he agreed with the populists, that it was possible. So Marx started to analyze what were the best reasons in his ideas, in his opinion, why capitalism should happen. And for example, Marx is saying that the Obshchina is a very particular experience, since in the rest of Europe, these old communal forms of property disappeared. But Marx also said that if history took a path in one country, this did not mean that fatally had to take the same path and the same course in other countries or in other periods. For example, Marx said, if we establish capitalism in Russia, should we wait for many decades before the industrial discoveries and technology will develop, or should we wait for a lot of time until the bank system is organized, as it is in England today, for example? The answer is no. So this means that there is no fatally replication of the history. And Marx is also concentrated on the fact that the Obshchina, he was always worried about analyzing historically in the existing historical conditions, whatever he had to write about. And the Obshchina is now existing at the same time of capitalist production. So here Marx used the famous expression that Russia could skip the Cowden forks of capitalism and move into socialism at a condition that I will tell you later, that Marx also wrote and published in this 1882 preface to the second edition of the Communist Manifesto. But when Marx is opening the door to the possibility that this will happen, that option number one could happen, Marx is never changing his idea about socialist society. So Marx is never conceiving socialism as, for example, there was a strong critique of Marx with Herzen, to mention another Russia, in the Russian translation of Capital. So Marx is never changing the idea that this socialist society is a society fully developed, and that this development is, first of all, a development for the emancipation, for the development of the individual. So there is no dramatic break and change with what Marx has been thinking for many years, and actually these ideas about capitalism you will also find in the critical notes on statism and anarchism written in Russia as a marginal notes of the book of Bakunin, or in the critique of the Gotha program 1875, or in the program that Marx wrote in the end of 1880 for the Socialist Party in France that was starting to become influential. So Marx is saying that the alternative proposed by Russian populists was achievable, and in a draft of a letter to Zasulich, he argued that, theoretically speaking, the Russian rural commune can preserve itself by developing its basis, the common ownership of land, and by eliminating the principle of private property, which it also implies. It can become a direct point of departure for the economic system toward which modern society tends. It can turn over a new leaf without beginning by committing suicide. It can gain possession of the fruit with which capitalist production has enriched mankind without passing through the capitalist regime. So Marx said that if this is possible, will be possible because of the political will of the revolutionary subject in every country, and because there is a favorable set of the circumstances. In this case, the circumstances are the coexistence of this old form, still communal, and these new forms of capitalism, very developed in England and in other countries. So the socialist transformation of an archaic form of community like Yoshina was for Marx possible if revolution comes at the opportune moment, if it concentrates all its forces so to allow the rural commune full scope. The latter will soon develop as an element of regeneration in Russian society and an element of superiority over the countries enslaved by capitalist system. As I told you, Marx also published a little bit of this with Engels in the preface to the Manifesto of the Communist Party. Can the Russian община pass directly to the higher form of communist society? The only answer possible today is if Russian revolution becomes the signal for a proletarian revolution in the West, so that the two complement each other, the present Russian common ownership of land may serve as a starting point for the communist development. There are many possible topics of discussion, and I will be finishing in 5 minutes. One topic of discussion is why Marx did not publish these letters, even though did not even send this letter to Zasulich. He wrote a short letter in which he said, I'm very sorry, I cannot send you anything in a publishable form, as she asked, because I've been having some health issues, which is true or not. There are some complicated thoughts in this Marx, also with respect to the idea that Marx is building on Henry Morgan, and the idea that the grandmother generally loves the grandchildren, sometimes even more than the mother and the dead. So the old communal form might turn into the socialist form, skipping one generation, in this case, skipping one age. So these things has to be analyzed very carefully, and obviously, in my opinion, Marx is not publishing these things also because they required much more strength that he had not at the time. in order to open such an important question with a very relevant political impact. And another question is what Marx understood about Russia and whether or not he was right or wrong on which points, etc. But these notes are important in my opinion because they are very useful for a new generation of readers of Marx. And I'm very happy today to see a very vast part of the audience made by young scholars and students. So these notes, like many others, again, are useful because they give us a different view of Marx, a Marx that is not merely focused with Europe, a Marx that is much, much less dogmatic and sure of what to do in comparison with the idea that we generally have of Marx, or of many Marxist books that have been written in the past decades. And the Marx that is denying the fact that there is a unilinear part of the history, that there are these stages and every society should pass through those stages. I believe that it's very useful to see that Marx was more flexible in considering the eruption of revolutionary events in different conditions. And I believe that Marx learned very much from the experience of the Paris Commune. He learned very much from the populist movement in Russia. And this does not mean that, his analysis changed, there was a dramatical break, or that he was not right about the fact that it was impossible to have a socialist revolution in Paris in 1871, as he said many times later. As you know, Marx was not in favor, or he was not excited about the possibility that there was the beginning of revolution when there were not the political condition. And Marx fought against this also before in his life, also in 1848, where many leaders said, now it's the time, the revolution is now, we go back to Germany, we take the power, and many were killed and died. So there is a multilinear conception of Marx, and he thought that it was possible that the revolution would break out in conditions and forms that he had never considered before. I believe that this is useful for us today, and I believe that this must always be related to the idea that Marx is a thinker of the self-emancipation of the working class. So Marx did not believe that history is following this path. Marx did not believe that there are some prophets that can take the lead. So in the end, he said, whatever you are analyzing, whatever is the kind of society you are analyzing, you always have to look at the historical circumstances, and only after that you can try to interpret the circumstances well, and then, based on this interpretation, you can fight for the emancipation. Many thanks.